Genocide is bad. We have a lot to talk about. First off, I want to thank you guys for 50,000 subscribers. It means a lot. I love you all, for real, for real. Be sure to check out some of the other videos. And yeah, let's go ahead and get right into it. The Holocaust was the systemic, state-sponsored genocide of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II between 1941 and 1945. Rooted in Nazi ideology, which viewed Jews as an existential threat to Germany and Western civilization, it was carried out through mass shootings, forced labor, starvation, and most infamously, extermination camps equipped with gas chambers. Now, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime implemented a series of escalating anti-Jewish policies beginning in 1933, which initially sought to exclude Jews from German society through discriminatory laws, boycotts, and violent programs like the Kristallnacht or the Night of Broken Glass. After the invasion of Poland in 1939, Jews were forcibly relocated into ghettos under appalling conditions, while Nazi officials debated plans for their, quote, final solution. And following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Einsatzgruppen death squads began executing Jewish communities en masse. This soon expanded into a comprehensive plan of industrialized murder with the construction of extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where millions of Jews were murdered in gas chambers upon arrival. Although Jews were the primary victims of the Holocaust, Nazi Germany also targeted and exterminated millions of non-Jewish civilians, including Romani people, disabled individuals, Polish and Soviet civilians, political dissidents, and Soviet prisoners of war. The genocide was enabled by widespread collaboration across Nazi-occupied Europe, with local governments and paramilitary groups aiding in deportations and mass executions. And by the time the Allied forces liberated concentration and extermination camps in 1945, much of Europe's Jewish population had already been decimated. And the genocide remains one of the darkest chapters in human history and has since become the defining example of the dangers of racism. The Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian genocides were part of a larger campaign of ethnic cleansing committed by the Ottoman Empire during and after World War I that aimed to eradicate its Christian populations. Now, the Armenian Genocide was the most extensive, with an estimated 800,000 to 1.2 million Armenians systematically murdered under the rule of the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, and branded as national security threat. Armenians were forcibly deported from their ancestral lands, enduring death marches through the Syrian desert where many perished from starvation, exhaustion, or execution. Ottoman paramilitary groups, particularly the Special Organization, carried out mass killings, targeting men for immediate execution while subjecting women and children to rape, abduction, and forced conversions. Survivors faced further suffering in concentration camps, while Armenian property was seized and redistributed to Muslim refugees. Meanwhile, the Greek and Assyrian genocides followed similar patterns of systematic persecution and mass killings. Pontic Greeks and Ionian Greeks were subjected to massacres, forced labor, death marches, and the destruction of their entire communities. And the culmination of it came in 1922 with the burning of Smyrna, where thousands of Greeks and Armenians were slaughtered, effectively ending the Greek presence in Asia Minor. The forced population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923 would further solidify this ethnic cleansing. Similarly, the Assyrian Genocide, also known as Sepho, the sword, led to the deaths of between 250,000 and 300,000 Assyrians across southeastern Anatolia, northern Mesopotamia, and northwest Persia. Though less centrally organized, the killings were carried out by Ottoman forces, Kurdish militias, and local Muslim populations, destroying entire Assyrian villages and religious sites. Now, despite historical documentation, survivor testimonies, and diplomatic records confirming these genocides, Turkey continues to deny them, dismissing them as mere wartime casualties rather than a systematic extermination.
Well, I don't think there was anything comparable to Auschwitz. This was only deportation, and things happened on the road.
But the deportations ended in massacres, didn't they?
No, it did not.
Weren't there massacres, mass executions, and death marches of the Armenians?
There was no death marches of Armenians. There was deportation, and tragic things happened. Many people perished under the deprivations of the First World War.
The Cambodian Genocide was a mass atrocity carried out by the Khmer Rouge regime under the leadership of Pol Pot between 1975 and 1979, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population at the time. Now, after the Khmer Rouge seized power on April 17, 1975, they sought to transform Cambodia into an agrarian socialist utopia. They were heavily influenced by Maoist ideology and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. To achieve this radical vision, the regime forcibly evacuated cities, sending millions of people to rural labor camps where they were subjected to forced labor, starvation, disease, and systematic executions. Intellectuals, professionals, religious figures, and perceived political enemies, including those who had any association with the previous government, were targeted for extermination, and ethnic and religious minorities such as Sham Muslims, Vietnamese, and Chinese Cambodians all faced persecution, and entire families were often executed to prevent any possibility of procreation. Mass killings took place in locations known as the killing fields, where victims were brutally murdered and buried in mass graves, often using crude weapons like axes and shovels to save bullets. The genocide only ended when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in December of 1978, overthrowing the Khmer Rouge in early 1979. However, by then, the country had been devastated by famine, mass killings, and the near total destruction of its cultural and intellectual institutions. The Vietnamese-backed government exposed these atrocities and established the People's Republic of Kampuchea, and it was not until 2003 that the Extraordinary Chambers in the Court of Cambodia, or the ECCC, was established, leading to the eventual persecution of top Khmer Rouge officials for crimes against humanity and genocide. The Holodomor was a devastating man-made famine that struck Soviet Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, resulting in the deaths of millions of Ukrainians. It was part of a broader famine that affected the Soviet Union, but Ukraine was disproportionately affected due to the Soviet government's harsh grain requisition policies, which forcibly took food from the peasantry. Now, under Joseph Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union began to pursue rapid industrialization and collectivization, forcibly consolidating small farms into state-controlled collectives. When Ukrainian farmers would resist these policies, the government increased grain quotas to impossible levels, leading to widespread food shortages. Authorities sealed off villages, confiscated crops and livestock, and prevented starving peasants from leaving famine-stricken areas, effectively turning the famine into a targeted weapon against the Ukrainian population. While some scholars argue that the famine was an unintended consequence of Soviet policies, others maintain that it was deliberately engineered as an act of genocide to crush Ukrainian nationalism and resistance to Soviet rule. The death toll of the Holodomor remains debated, but estimates range from 3.5 to 10 million deaths, as entire villages were wiped out and reports of cannibalism and mass graves became widespread as people succumbed to starvation. The famine was exacerbated by policies such as the blacklisting of villages, where entire communities were cut off from food supplies, and movement of peasants seeking food was restricted. Actual public discussion of the Holodomor was banned in the Soviet Union for decades, and it was only acknowledged during the late 1980s. And today, Ukraine and many other countries recognize the Holodomor as genocide, citing Stalin's deliberate policies of food confiscation, border sealing, and persecution of Ukrainian cultural and political leaders as evidence of intent to exterminate a national group. The Soviet deportation of the Chechens in Ingush, also known as Operation Lentil, was a brutal forced population transfer carried out by the NKVD on February 23, 1944, under the orders of Joseph Stalin. Nearly 500,000 Chechens and Ingush or Venak people were accused, without evidence, of collaborating with Nazi Germany, despite many of them actually having served in the Red Army. Under this pretext, Soviet authorities carried out a mass ethnic cleansing operation, rounding up entire communities with little warning and cramming them into overcrowded cattle trains bound for remote areas of Central Asia, mainly Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The journey itself, lasting weeks, was marked by starvation, disease, freezing temperatures, and horrific conditions, leading to thousands of deaths, with bodies often discarded along the tracks. Those unable to travel, including the elderly and sick, were frequently executed on the spot, and entire villages were massacred. Upon arrival, the deportees faced harsh conditions in desolate settlements, forced into hard labor while enduring extreme climates, food shortages, and disease, which led to catastrophic casualties. Meanwhile, the Chechen Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic was dissolved, and its lands were redistributed to neighboring republics, and Russian settlers moved into the abandoned homes. Branded as traitors, the Chechens and Ingush saw their culture suppressed and their history erased from Soviet records. And it was only after Stalin's death when Nikita Khrushchev condemned the deportation, allowing them to return to their homeland in 1957. But this was fraught with difficulties as they continued to face hostility from the new settlers and struggled with displacement and discrimination. The trauma of the deportation left deep scars and contributed to future conflicts, fueling nationalist resistance that played a key role in the Chechen wars of the 1990s and 2000s. And today, the deportation is widely regarded as an act of genocide, officially recognized by the European Parliament in 2004. The Bangladesh Genocide of 1971 was a brutal campaign of mass murder, ethnic cleansing, and sexual violence carried out by the Pakistani army and allied militias against the Bengali population of East Pakistan during the country's struggle for independence. The violence officially began on March 25, 1971, with Operation Searchlight, which was a military crackdown launched by the West Pakistani regime under General Yahya Khan to suppress Bengali nationalism after the Awami League's victory in the 1970 general elections. Labeling the Bengali independence movement as a threat to Pakistan's unity, the military targeted nationalists, students, intellectuals, and especially Hindu civilians who they viewed as sympathizers of the separatist cause. Over 9 months, Pakistani forces carried out mass executions, arson, and systematic rape, killing an estimated 300,000 to 3 million people. Hindu communities face particularly severe persecution, with homes marked for destruction and entire neighborhoods wiped out. Rape was weaponized as a tool of war, with thousands of Bengali women abducted and held in military camps where they were raped. And in the final days of the war, Pakistani forces executed Bangladesh's leading intellectuals to cripple the new nation's recovery. The genocide itself triggered one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century, with around 10 million Bengalis, mostly Hindus, fleeing to India. This humanitarian catastrophe, coupled with Pakistan's atrocities, led India to intervene in December of 1971, defeating Pakistani forces and securing Bangladesh's independence. Despite overwhelming evidence, Pakistan continues to deny the genocide, and many of the perpetrators have never faced justice. The Guatemalan Genocide, also known as the Maya Genocide or the Silent Holocaust, was a systematic mass killing of indigenous Maya civilians by the Guatemalan military government during the Guatemalan Civil War. While initially part of a counterinsurgency campaign against leftist guerrilla groups like the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, or EGP, the violence escalated into deliberate ethnic cleansing, with government accusing entire Maya communities of supporting the insurgency. All right, so state repression had been widespread in this conflict since the 1960s, but between 1978 and 1984, particularly under General Efrain Rios-Montt, the military would go on to commit over 600 documented massacres, destroying over 400 villages, and engaging in mass executions, rape, forced disappearances, and child killings. The United Nations-backed Commission for Historical Clarification would estimate that around 200,000 people were killed, 40,000 disappeared, and 83% of the victims were Maya. Rooted in historical racism and economic inequality, this genocide was fueled by Cold War geopolitics, particularly the US-backed 1954 coup that ousted the democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz, which resulted in reinforcing military rule and the protection of elite landowners and foreign corporate interests, such as the United Fruit Company. The Guatemalan Civil War would then begin 6 years later in 1960, and by the early 1980s, counterinsurgency efforts would turn into full-scale ethnic cleansing, with the military burning villages, forcibly displacing survivors into military-controlled camps or refugee camps in Mexico, and justifying atrocities under the guise of anti-communism. General Efrain, an evangelical Christian, framed the campaign as a divine war against subversion. And after the war, efforts to seek justice led to some of the military officials being tried for crimes against humanity, with General Efrain being convicted of genocide in 2013, though his sentence was later overturned. The Indonesian mass killings of 1965 and 1966 were a large-scale anti-communist purge orchestrated by the Indonesian army under Suharto, targeting members and sympathizers of the Communist Party of Indonesia, or the PKI, as well as trade unionists, ethnic Chinese, leftist intellectuals, atheists, and suspected dissidents. Now, this was all sparked by the failed September 30th movement coup, which was a failed coup attempt in Indonesia on September 30th, 1965, which was led by the Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI, and the movement kidnapped and killed 6 high-ranking Indonesian generals. Suharto would quickly crush this rebellion, and the violence that followed would be described as one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century, and saw an estimated 500,000 to 3 million people killed. The Indonesian army, backed by Western powers like the United States and the United Kingdom, led a propaganda campaign against the PKI, branding individuals as national traitors and fueling widespread massacres carried out by military units, militias, and vigilante groups, with the most intense bloodshed occurring in Central and East Java. Victims were beheaded, dismembered, shot, or hacked to death, with rivers becoming clogged with bodies. As the killing subsided in early 1966, over 1 million suspected communists were imprisoned, many under brutal conditions, and the PKI was outlawed, and Indonesian political life was purged of leftist influence. The purge led directly to the downfall of President Sukarno and the rise of Suharto, who ruled as an authoritarian for over 3 decades. Despite overwhelming evidence, the Indonesian government continues to downplay or suppress discussion of the massacre, and many of the perpetrators were never held accountable. The Burundian Genocides of 1972 and 1993 were 2 major waves of mass killings rooted in deep-seated ethnic tensions between the Hutu majority and the Tutsi minority, exacerbated by colonial legacies and the power struggles following independence. Firstly, the 1972 genocide, known as Ikiza, or the Catastrophe, was orchestrated by the Tutsi-dominated military regime of Michel Micombero in response to a failed Hutu-led uprising. This led to the systematic extermination of Hutu elites, politicians, intellectuals, and community leaders, resulting in an estimated 100,000 to 300,000 deaths. This purge decimated Hutu leadership and solidified Tutsi control over the military and government. However, violence would erupt again in 1993 after the assassination of Burundi's first democratically elected Hutu president, Melchior Ndadaye. In retaliation, Hutu extremists would launch widespread massacres against Tutsis across the country, which triggered brutal counterattacks from the Tutsi-dominated military and culminated in at least 160,000 deaths and fueling a civil war that lasted for years. While the 1993 violence remains debated as either a spontaneous ethnic conflict or a premeditated genocide, both episodes left deep scars, further entrenching ethnic divisions. And both events have often been overshadowed by the 1994 Rwandan Genocide. The Rwandan Genocide, also known as the Genocide against the Tutsi, would occur from April to July of 1994 during the Rwandan Civil War, resulting in the systematic mass killing of Tutsi civilians, as well as moderate Hutu and Twa. Over the span of 100 days, an estimated 500,000 to 662,000 Tutsi people were murdered. The violence was characterized by extreme brutality, with victims often being killed by neighbors and subjected to widespread sexual violence, with between 250,000 and 500,000 women being raped. As we talked about, this was rooted in long-standing ethnic tensions and was further exacerbated by the Rwandan Civil War that began in 1990, and this genocide would be sparked by the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana on April 6, 1994, when his plane was shot down, and this act would then be used by Hutu extremists as a pretext for mass killings. This extremist Hutu power movement, supported by state institutions and media, incited hatred and orchestrated the genocide, utilizing government forces, the Interahamwe militia, and civilians to carry out these massacres. And despite knowledge of the unfolding atrocities, the international community largely failed to intervene, with the United Nations reducing its peacekeeping presence and Western powers hesitant to engage in the conflict. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Paul Kagame, launched a military offensive to halt the killings, and the genocide was ended by mid-July. The aftermath saw a humanitarian crisis, with 2 million Hutu, including perpetrators, fleeing to Zaire, leading to regional instability and the First and Second Congo Wars. In this tragedy, widely covered in media and pop culture through films like Hotel Rwanda and books such as Shake Hands with the Devil, remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history, serving as a reminder of the consequences of ethnic division, propaganda, and international inaction. The Bosnian Genocide, occurring during the Bosnian War of 1992, involved a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Army of Republika Srpska, or the VRS, against Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat populations, culminating in the 1995 Srebrenica massacre. Under the command of General Ratko Mladic, VRS forces executed over 8,000 Bosnian men and boys in Srebrenica and forcibly expelled between 25,000 and 30,000 civilians, marking the largest mass killing in Europe since World War II. Now, the broader ethnic cleansing campaign in VRS-controlled areas included mass killings, unlawful detentions, systematic rape, torture, destruction of property, and targeting of political leaders, intellectuals, and civilians. And internationally, the events were widely recognized as genocide, with convictions in German courts, and key figures were prosecuted, including Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic and General Mladic, who were both sentenced to life imprisonment for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. However, the trial of Slobodan Milosevic, Serbia's former president, would end with his death before a final verdict was reached, but evidence suggested his involvement in a joint criminal enterprise to ethnically cleanse non-Serbs from Bosnia. Of course, the United Nations and Western nations would also face condemnation for failing to intervene, and death toll estimates vary, with the Research and Documentation Center confirming at least 97,000 documented deaths, though estimates often cite up to 200,000 people being killed. The East Timor Genocide refers to the Indonesian invasion and the occupation of East Timor from 1975 to 1999, during which the Indonesian military waged systematic state terrorism and pacification campaigns that resulted in mass killings, enforced starvation, and severe human rights abuses, with estimates of the death toll ranging from 60,000 to over 300,000. Now, their initial invasion in December of 1975 saw widespread massacres, with Indonesian forces executing thousands of civilians across the countryside, often targeting suspected supporters of the independence movement, Fretilin, as well as ethnic Chinese residents. Reports described entire villages being wiped out, including notorious cases where most residents in their villages were massacred. After consolidating control, Indonesia began forcing civilians into detention camps where starvation, disease, and executions were rampant. Systematic sexual violence, including forced marriages and sterilization campaigns, were also documented, with Amnesty International and other organizations detailing the military's widespread use of rape as a tool of terror. Counterinsurgency operations, such as the Fence of Legs campaign, forcibly conscripted tens of thousands of Timorese as human shields, many of whom died from exhaustion or were massacred alongside civilians in Indonesian operations. The eventual 1991 Santa Cruz massacre, where Indonesian soldiers killed at least 250 peaceful demonstrators in Dili, was captured on film, and this would spark international outrage, fueling global activism against Indonesia's occupation. And as international pressure mounted, a 1999 referendum resulted in an overwhelming vote for independence, which would then trigger a final wave of destruction by Indonesian militias and military forces before an international intervention ended the occupation. And while many scholars and human rights organizations classify the Indonesian actions as genocide, legal debates persist due to the lack of recognition of political and cultural groups under the Genocide Convention. Nevertheless, Indonesia's actions in East Timor remain one of the most devastating episodes of 20th century state-sponsored violence, often compared to other genocides such as those in Cambodia and Rwanda. The Darfur Genocide was a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing and mass violence carried out primarily against the Fur, Masalit, and Zagwa ethnic groups during the war in Darfur from 2003 to present day. Now, the Sudanese government, led by President Omar al-Bashir, armed and supported the Janjaweed militias, who would become responsible for mass killings, widespread rape, forced displacement, and the destruction of villages. This genocide stemmed from political and ethnic tensions, with Darfur's African communities being marginalized by the Arab-dominated government, and an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 people were killed. And by 2008, approximately 2.7 million civilians were displaced. There were reports of genocidal rape, with victims ranging from elderly women to children, often committed in front of family members to inflict maximum psychological devastation. In the international community, including the United Nations, African Union, and the International Criminal Court, or ICC, attempted to intervene by establishing the UNAMID peacekeeping mission in 2007 and later indicting Omar al-Bashir and several others for crimes against humanity and genocide. However, the conflict would still persist into the late 2010s, with reports of chemical weapons attacks and continued violence, and millions of Darfuris fled to Chad, where refugee camps struggled with resource shortages. And while some displaced people have begun returning home under UN supervision, the region still largely remains unstable, and the ICC continues to seek justice for the atrocities. The Anfal Campaign, conducted by Ba'athist Iraq from February to September 1988, under the leadership of Ali Hassan al-Mashid, was a brutal counterinsurgency operation targeting the Kurdish population in northern Iraq. Ordered by Saddam Hussein, it aimed to crush Kurdish resistance and eliminate rural Kurdish communities, and the campaign involved ground offensives, aerial bombings, mass executions, forced displacement, and chemical warfare, including the infamous Halabja chemical attack that killed thousands of civilians. Iraqi forces, aided by Kurdish collaborators known as Jash, destroyed approximately 1,200 villages, forcibly relocating survivors into detention camps and executing an estimated 50,000 to 100,000 people. Men were systematically separated from women and children before being executed, while the survivors were detained in camps such as Nugra Salman and Tabzawa, where conditions were dire. This campaign's genocidal nature would be affirmed by the Human Rights Watch and later recognized by a Dutch court in 2005. And after Saddam Hussein's eventual fall, mass graves would be uncovered, and in 2007, Ali Hassan al-Majid would be sentenced to death for genocide and executed in 2010. The Biafran Genocide, which occurred during the Nigerian Civil War from July 6, 1967 to January 15, 1970, was a brutal and devastating conflict that led to the deaths of between 500,000 and 2 million Biafran civilians, primarily due to starvation caused by deliberate Nigerian government blockades. So the war began after the Republic of Biafra, led by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Ojukwu, seceded from Nigeria following years of ethnic, religious, and political tensions, including the mass killings of Igbo people and anti-Igbo programs in northern Nigeria in 1966. Now, after this secession, the Nigerian government, under General Yakubu Gowon, would launch a full-scale military offensive against Biafra, swiftly capturing key cities and oil facilities. In addition to the military assaults, the Nigerian government would impose an economic blockade that prevented food, medicine, and humanitarian aid from reaching Biafra, leading to widespread famine that disproportionately affected the civilians, resulting in haunting images of starving and malnourished Biafran children that shocked the global community. International efforts to provide relief, such as the Biafran airlift, would be met with resistance from the Nigerian government, which viewed aid organizations as interfering in what was considered an internal conflict. And despite widespread recognition of the humanitarian crisis, key global powers such as the United Kingdom and Soviet Union continued to support Nigeria, supplying arms and military assistance, while France and Israel provided limited aid to Biafra. The conflict was one of the first African wars to be widely televised, bringing attention to the suffering of the Biafran people and leading to a surge in international humanitarian activism. And the war would end with the fall of Biafra in January 1970, forcing Ojukwu into exile and leaving the Igbo population politically and economically marginalized. Although Nigeria officially promoted reconciliation, policies such as the economic strangulation of Igbo businesses and the seizure of Igbo properties under the guise of, quote, abandoned properties further deepened the post-war suffering of the Igbo people. And today, many Igbos state they continue to face systemic discrimination, leading to the rise of neo-Biafran movements like the Indigenous Peoples of Biafra, or the IPOB, and the events of the Biafran War, particularly the starvation policies and mass killings, have been classified by some scholars as genocide, though the Nigerian government has never acknowledged it as such. The genocide of the Tamil population in Sri Lanka was a systemic and prolonged campaign of violence, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes primarily committed by the Sinhalese majority Sri Lankan government against the Tamil minority, particularly during the final stages of the Sri Lankan Civil War in 2009. This was rooted in decades of discrimination, state-sponsored anti-Tamil programs, and military crackdowns, and this would all lead to the beginning of the Sri Lankan Civil War in 1983, which was a brutal conflict between the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, which we have talked about. And they were a separatist militant group fighting for an independent Tamil state in northern and eastern Sri Lanka. Of course, this began after the years of ethnic tensions between the Sinhalese majority and Tamil minority and escalated into full-scale violence following the Black July riots in 1983, where thousands of Tamils would be killed by anti-Tamil programs. The Tamil Tigers would use guerrilla warfare and bombings, while the government would respond with heavy military operations. Now, this genocide would culminate in the final months of the war when Sri Lankan military engaged in widespread massacres, extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, sexual violence, and the indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas that were designated as no-fire zones, particularly where thousands of Tamil civilians had sought refuge. The government imposed a blockade on food, medicine, and humanitarian aid, exacerbating the suffering of an estimated 350,000 trapped civilians. And the United Nations estimated that as many as 40,000 Tamil civilians were killed in the final phase of the war. Reports by human rights organizations documented the deliberate targeting of hospitals, use of heavy artillery against civilian populations, and mass graves, while Tamil survivors accused government forces of executing surrendering combatants and civilians alike. However, the Tamil Tigers, who were fighting for an independent Tamil homeland, also committed atrocities, including the forced recruitment of child soldiers and suicide bombings. In the aftermath of the war, the Sri Lankan government would use this to frame their actions as counterterrorism. Despite this, international bodies and Tamil advocacy groups have classified the mass killings as genocide, and the Sri Lankan government has continuously denied allegations of genocide and blocked independent investigations. Since 2014, the Chinese government, under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, has carried out systematic human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslim population and other Turkic minorities in Xinjiang, actions that have been widely characterized as ethnic persecution, cultural genocide, and in some cases, genocide itself. The campaign, initiated under the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism, escalated significantly in 2017 under Xinjiang CCP Secretary Chen Quanguo, resulting in the internment of over 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps, the largest mass detention of an ethnic religious minority group since World War II. Detainees have been subjected to forced labor, political indoctrination, torture, sexual violence, enforced disappearances, and severe restrictions on religious and cultural practices. And in addition to mass detention, Chinese authorities have demolished an estimated 16,000 mosques, forcibly separated Uyghur families, imposed widespread surveillance, and engaged in reproductive control through forced sterilizations, contraception, and abortions, leading to an 84% drop in birth rates in some Uyghur majority areas between 2015 and 2018. Now, Chinese officials, of course, deny these accusations, insisting that the measures are counterterrorism efforts against extremism and separatism. And internationally, China's actions have been met with varied reactions. Some nations, including the United States, Canada, and the UK, have labeled them as genocide, while others have supported China's policies or remained silent. Between 2014 and 2017, the Islamic State, or ISIS, carried out the Yazidi Genocide, which was a campaign of massacres, systematic rape, sexual slavery, and forced conversions primarily targeting the Yazidi people, who were a Kurdish-speaking religious minority indigenous to the Kurdistan region. Now, ISIS viewed Yazidis as heretics and labeled them as not being entitled to the protections afforded to, quote, people of the book under Islamic law, which led to the mass execution of Yazidi men and the trafficking of Yazidi women and girls as sex slaves. The United Nations would estimate that ISIS killed approximately 5,000 Yazidis and enslaved 4,000 to 10,000 women and children, subjecting them to brutal conditions, including forced abortions and sexual violence. And in August of 2014, ISIS would overrun Sinjar, forcing 50,000 Yazidis to flee to the Sinjar Mountains, where many died from starvation and dehydration. The United States, the United Kingdom, and other coalition forces would launch emergency airdrops of supplies and airstrikes against ISIS to halt the offensive, while Kurdish forces, including the PKK and YPG, would open a humanitarian corridor to evacuate the survivors. This genocide would prompt international condemnation, with the UN, European Union, and several nations officially recognizing it as genocide. And despite the eventual military defeat of ISIS, thousands of Yazidis remain missing or displaced, and some Yazidi women have been rescued from captivity, including in Syria, and some even as far as the Gaza Strip, but many still remain enslaved or unaccounted for. The Rohingya Genocide is an ongoing campaign of persecution and mass violence against the Muslim Rohingya people by the Myanmar military, with two major phases. Firstly was an initial crackdown from October 2016 to January 2017, and second was a more severe wave beginning in August of 2017. This was all rooted in decades of systematic discrimination, denial of citizenship, and marginalization, and the genocide itself would result in widespread killings, mass rapes, arson, and forced displacement, with UN reports estimating at least 25,000 deaths, 18,000 instances of sexual violence, and over 36,000 people being burned alive. The military, in collaboration with Buddhist nationalist groups, would engage in mass executions, gang rapes, and destruction of Rohingya villages, triggering one of the largest human exoduses in modern Asian history, with over 1 million Rohingya fleeing to neighboring Bangladesh and other parts of South and Southeast Asia. And as of 2024, the genocide continues with reports of renewed massacres, forced conscription of Rohingya men into the Myanmar military, and continued ongoing repression. This one is a very delicate topic, and no doubt there's going to be war in the comments over this. So, the Palestinian Genocide. Firstly, we're going to have to cover the whole history of this. All right. So the origin of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lie in the rise of political Zionism, which was a movement that was founded in the late 19th century in Europe with the goal of establishing a Jewish homeland. Zionism was largely a response to widespread European anti-Semitism, which culminated in violent discrimination across Europe. Theodor Herzl was considered the father of Zionism, and he promoted the idea that Jews could only achieve safety through self-determination and the establishment of a Jewish state. Therefore, Zionist settlers began immigrating to Ottoman-controlled Palestine, starting with the first Aliyah in 1882 to 1903 and the second Aliyah in 1904 to 1914. These early Jewish settlers primarily established agricultural communities that were funded by European benefactors such as Baron Rothschild. However, as Jewish land purchases increased, tensions began to rise between the settlers and the indigenous Palestinian Arab population. This local Arab population, which had lived on the land for centuries, increasingly viewed Zionism as a colonial movement that was aimed at displacing them. Now, World War I would significantly alter the political landscape of the Middle East, as the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine, collapsed, and Britain would then take control of the region through the League of Nations mandate. Britain would make conflicting promises regarding the future of Palestine, and in 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, which pledged to support the creation of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. However, Britain had also promised Arab leaders that they would support the establishment of an independent Arab state in the region, including Palestine, through the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence in 1915. Furthermore, Britain and France had secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which would divide the Middle East between their colonial empires. As a result of all these conflicting promises, tensions in Palestine would escalate. Jewish immigration would surge, particularly following the rise of Nazism in the 1930s, and European Jews would flee persecution, seeking refuge in Palestine. The increase in Jewish immigration would lead to violent clashes between Palestinian Arabs and Jewish settlers, culminating in the 1936 Arab Revolt. The revolt began with a general strike in April of 1936 and evolved into an armed insurrection. British authorities would seek diplomatic solutions, but by 1937, they shifted to a brutal military crackdown, using mass arrests, home demolitions, aerial bombings, and collective punishment to crush the rebellion, killing thousands of Palestinians and suppressing the uprising with assistance from Zionist militias. This all resulted in Palestinian leadership was forced into exile, leaving the Arab resistance largely fractured. Meanwhile, the British-supported Zionist militias like the Haganah would strengthen Jewish military capabilities. By 1939, the Arab revolt had been decisively suppressed and led to a weakened Palestinian national movement that struggled to resist Zionist military expansion. With the Holocaust and World War II leading to the deaths of millions of Jews, international sympathy for the Zionist cause would then increase. And in 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan that would divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. While Zionist leaders accepted the plan, Palestinian and Arab leaders rejected it, arguing that it disproportionately allocated land to the Jewish population, who comprised 1/3 of the population but were given 56% of the land. Following this UN partition plan, which was enforced, civil war would erupt between Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine. On May 14, 1948, the Zionist leadership declared the establishment of the State of Israel, and the next day, neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon would invade in support of the Palestinian Arab population, which launched the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. During the war, Zionist militias, including the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, would carry out a series of military campaigns, expelling and massacring Palestinian communities. This resulted in the Nakba, during which over 750,000 Palestinian Arabs were forcibly expelled from their homes. Hundreds of Palestinian villages were destroyed or depopulated, and the newly established Israeli state refused to allow the refugees to return. By the war's end in 1949, Israel would gain control of 78% of historic Palestine. The remaining 22%, that being the West Bank and Gaza Strip, would fall under Jordanian and Egyptian control. Palestinians were left stateless, with millions living in refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries. The next major turning point of the Arab-Israeli conflict would come in 1967 during the Six-Day War, when Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In just 6 days, Israel would seize the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan. They would also seize Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and also Golan Heights from Syria. And the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, that being West Bank and Gaza, has remained in place since then, making it the longest ongoing military occupation in modern history. Under its occupation, Palestinians have faced widespread human rights violations, including land confiscation, home demolitions, mass arrests, and military control over daily life. Israel has built illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank, moving in hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And these settlements, combined with military checkpoints, barriers, and restrictions on Palestinian movement, have led to many human rights organizations to accuse Israel of creating an apartheid-like system. This would all lead to Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. In 1987, the first Intifada would erupt, involving mass protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience. Israel would respond with force, killing thousands of Palestinians and implementing policies such as home demolitions and administrative detention. The Oslo Accords in 1993 would bring temporary hope and establish the Palestinian Authority, or PA, to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza, but Israeli settlements continued to expand. In 2000, after the failure of peace negotiations, the Second Intifada would break out, and this time the conflict was more violent, with suicide bombings by Palestinian militant groups and heavy Israeli military crackdown. In response, Israel conducted a massive separation wall in the West Bank, which the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, later ruled as illegal. In 2006, Hamas, an Islamist political and militant group, would win Palestinian legislative elections, and in response, Israel and the US imposed economic sanctions on the Palestinian government. By 2007, after violent clashes between Hamas and Fatah, which was the ruling party in the West Bank, Hamas would then take full control of Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority would retain control over the West Bank. Israel would then impose a full blockade on Gaza, severely restricting food, medicine, and essential supplies, leading to a deep humanitarian crisis. And over the years, multiple wars would erupt between Israel and Hamas, with Israel airstrikes killing thousands of civilians. And the UN has repeatedly condemned Israel's actions, and reports of human rights organizations have accused Israel of war crimes. The conflict between Israel and Hamas has been characterized by multiple wars, with both sides accused of killing civilians and violating international law. Hamas has conducted attacks such as suicide bombings and cross-border raids, with the October 7th, 2023 assault being one of the deadliest attacks in Israel's history. And the attack killed more than 1,200 people, including women and children, and involved hostage taking, which was widely condemned as a war crime. Now, Israel, in turn, has also been widely criticized for its military operations in Gaza, which have led to thousands of Palestinian civilian deaths. And the IDF argue that their strikes are aimed at eliminating Hamas militants and military infrastructure. However, airstrikes and artillery bombardments often hit densely populated neighborhoods, killing large numbers of civilians, and has resulted in thousands of Palestinian deaths, including many women and children. And the United Nations and human rights organizations have accused Israel of using disproportionate force and failing to distinguish between military and civilian targets. And the International Criminal Court, or ICC, has been investigating alleged war crimes committed both by Israel and Hamas. And in January of 2024, South Africa would file a case at the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. And Israel would defend its actions as self-defense. Officially on January 26, 2024, the ICJ issued a preliminary ruling finding that the claims of South Africa's filing were, quote, plausible, and issued an order to Israel that required them to take all measures within their power to prevent acts of genocide and allow basic humanitarian services into Gaza. Israel and the United States have rejected the assertion that Israel is engaging in acts of genocide. However, the following countries and international organizations state that they are committing genocide, that being Algeria, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Djibouti, Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Ireland, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Malaysia, Maldives, Namibia, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Palestine, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Slovenia, Spain, Syria, Turkey, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, African Union, Arab League, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the Non-Aligned Movement. The Great Leap Forward, beginning in 1958, was an economic and social campaign initiated by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, under Chairman Mao Zedong, that aimed at rapidly transforming China from an agrarian society into an industrialized socialist state through collectivization and mass mobilization. It sought to increase agricultural and industrial output, but unrealistic production targets, the suppression of technical expertise, and a political climate of fear led to inflated grain quotas, excessive requisitioning, and widespread famine. Estimates suggest that between 15 to 55 million people died, making it one of the deadliest man-made disasters in history. The campaign introduced people's communes, abolished private farming, and emphasized rural industrialization, including backyard steel production, but poor planning and mismanagement led to economic collapse, environmental destruction, and food shortages. The famine was exacerbated by the state's refusal to acknowledge failures and repression of dissent, with mass executions and torture used to enforce policies. And the eventual political fallout saw Mao partially retreat from direct leadership, allowing pragmatic leaders like Deng Xiaoping to implement reforms, though Mao would later launch the Cultural Revolution to reassert his authority. And the disastrous consequences of the Great Leap Forward reshaped Chinese governance, leading to shifts in economic policy and the prioritization of more practical, gradual development strategies in subsequent decades. The Central African Republic Civil War is a brutal and ongoing conflict characterized by cycles of sectarian violence between Muslim and Christian militias, fueled by political instability, ethnic tensions, and competition over the country's vast natural resources, including diamonds and gold. The war would begin in 2012, following accusations by the Muslim-dominated Seleka rebel coalition that President Francois Bozize had failed to implement the 2007 peace accords that ended the previous Central African Republic Bush War. Following this, Seleka would launch an offensive, capturing multiple towns and seizing the capital Bangui in 2013, forcing President Bozize to flee. Seleka's leader, Michel Djotodia, would declare himself president, becoming the country's first Muslim head of state, but he would lose control over his fighters, who would begin committing widespread atrocities against Christians. In response, Christian self-defense militias, known as Anti-Balaka, would emerge and begin their own retaliatory attacks against Muslim civilians, accusing them of supporting Seleka. Both sides would engage in mass killings, ethnic cleansing, and village destruction, all leading to the country becoming effectively split, with Seleka factions controlling the north and Anti-Balaka dominating the south and west. Despite Michel Djotodia's resignation in 2014, the violence would continue under interim leader Catherine Samba Panza as the anti-Balaka militias unleashed a campaign of terror, forcing hundreds of thousands of Muslims to flee the country, destroying over 90% of the country's mosques and killing civilians in gruesome attacks that included beheadings, mutilations, and instances of cannibalism. The United Nations would deploy a peacekeeping mission, while France and the African Union would also send troops under Operation Sangaris. However, their efforts were often criticized as ineffective, and in 2016, the election of Faustin Archange Touadéra as president did little to stabilize the situation. Various armed groups would splinter, leading to new power struggles, particularly between ex-Seleka factions such as the FPRC and UPC and anti-Balaka groups. The conflict would intensify in 2020 when former President Bozize would return and allegedly coordinated the formation of the Coalition of Patriots for Change, which was an alliance of rebels opposing President Faustin Archange Touadéra. This would lead to a failed rebel advance on Bangui, but the war would take a new turn with increased Russian and Rwandan involvement, as Wagner Group mercenaries would support the government in pushing rebels back and retaking key towns in 2021. Human rights abuses would be attributed to all sides, including massacres, sexual violence, and targeted assassinations, and the religious divide remains a central theme, with Christians and Muslims alike suffering from displacement and mass killings. The Mau Mau Rebellion, also known as the Mau Mau Uprising or Kenya Emergency, was a brutal and prolonged anti-colonial conflict in British Kenya, waged primarily by the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, or KLFA, commonly referred to as the Mau Mau, against British authorities and their local allies. The KLFA sought to reclaim land and attain self-governance from European settlers, whose control over Kenya's most fertile lands, especially the White Highlands, had been solidified through decades of systematic expropriation and forced labor policies. The conflict emerged as a response to deep-seated grievances rooted in British colonial rule, which had displaced native Kenyans from their ancestral lands, imposed harsh labor conditions, levied oppressive taxes, and implemented racial segregation and economic subjugation. From the early 20th century, the colonial government had progressively eroded native land rights, culminating in the Carter Land Commission of 1934, which further disenfranchised the Kikuyu or other ethnic groups by allocating vast tracts of fertile land to European settlers, while confining indigenous populations to overcrowded reserves. As tensions mounted, African political agitation increased, with organizations like the Kenyan African Union demanding agrarian reforms and political representation, though these efforts were largely ignored by colonial authorities. In response, the Mau Mau adapted guerrilla tactics, waging a violent insurgency primarily in the forests of Mount Kenya, launching night raids, assassinations, and acts of sabotage against colonial infrastructure. The British government would respond with overwhelming force, declaring a state of emergency on October 20th, 1952, launching mass arrests through Operation Jock Scott, and implementing a ruthless counterinsurgency campaign that included aerial bombardments, mass internment, forced relocations, and widespread use of torture, mutilation, and summary executions. The British military, along with colonial security forces like the Kikuyu Home Guard, systematically targeted suspected Mau Mau members, often engaging in indiscriminate violence that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of native Kenyans, many of whom were civilians caught in the crossfire. The British established an extensive network of detention camps, often described as a gulag system, where prisoners were subjected to forced labor, brutal beatings, castration, sexual violence, and psychological torture in an effort to extract confessions and force loyalty to the colonial regime. This program saw over 1.5 million Kikuyu forcibly relocated into heavily guarded settlements, leading to widespread malnutrition, disease, and death, particularly among children. The eventual capture of Mau Mau leader, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi, on October 21st, 1956, marked the effective military defeat of the rebellion, though sporadic resistance continued until Kenya gained its independence. The Algerian War of Independence was a brutal anti-colonial conflict between France and the National Liberation Front, or FLN, who was an Algerian nationalist group fighting for independence. Now, the war began with the FLN's coordinated attacks on French military and civilian targets on November 1st, 1954, and it quickly escalated into a violent struggle marked by guerrilla warfare, urban terrorism, and mass repression. France would deploy hundreds of thousands of troops using torture, extrajudicial executions, and mass arrests to suppress the rebellion. The war deeply divided French society, leading to political crises that resulted in the collapse of the Fourth Republic and the rise of Charles de Gaulle's Fifth Republic. And the Algerian Genocide, though debated as a formal term, refers to the mass killings, torture, and forced relocations carried out by the French military and colonial authorities against the Algerian civilians during this period. Historians estimate that between 400,000 and 1.5 million Algerians died due to massacres, bombings, and systematic repression, and over 2 million Algerians were forcibly displaced into internment camps, and entire villages were destroyed as part of a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. The end of the war would lead to further bloodshed, particularly in the massacre of Harkis, who were Algerian Muslims that had fought for France, tens of thousands of whom were killed by the FLN and lynch mobs. And the war would leave lasting scars on both Algeria and France, with its legacy still shaping Franco-Algerian relations today. The First and Second Liberian Civil Wars were two of the most devastating conflicts in West African history, characterized by extreme violence, ethnic massacres, and the extensive use of child soldiers. Now, the first war would erupt in 1989 when Charles Taylor, a former government official accused of embezzlement, launched an armed rebellion through his National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or NPFL, to overthrow President Samuel Doe, whose government was infamous for corruption and ethnic favoritism towards the Kron people. Now, Samuel Doe had seized power in a 1980 coup and brutally suppressed opposition, particularly targeting the Geo and Mano ethnic groups. And the following war in 1989 would quickly descend into a chaotic multi-factional struggle, with Taylor's NPFL splintering as Prince Johnson formed the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or INPFL, and they would go on to capture and gruesomely execute Samuel Doe in 1990. The violence during this war engulfed the country, with numerous warlords and militias committing atrocities, including mass rapes, village massacres, and forced recruitment of child soldiers. Over 200,000 people were killed, with millions more displaced as neighboring countries struggled with waves of refugees. Peace efforts by ECOWAS and the United Nations led to a fragile ceasefire in 1995, culminating in elections in 1997, which saw Charles Taylor rise to power as Liberia's new president. However, despite Taylor's election, Liberia remained volatile, and the Second Liberian Civil War would erupt in 1999 when anti-Taylor rebel groups, including the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, or LURD, launched an insurgency from Guinea. Taylor's rule would be marked by extreme repression. human rights abuses, and support for Sierra Leonean rebels in exchange for conflict diamonds. The war saw continued ethnic violence, with civilians bearing the brunt of the atrocities, including genocidal massacres targeting Kron and Mandingo communities. Armed factions engaged in indiscriminate killings, sexual violence, and forced displacement of entire villages. The conflict reached a climax when rebels besieged Monrovia, prompting ECOWAS and the United Nations to intervene. Facing mounting pressure, Taylor resigned and was later extradited to The Hague, where he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The war ultimately claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and left Liberia in economic ruin, with entire generations traumatized by years of brutal warfare. The First and Second Congo Wars were among the deadliest conflicts in modern history, involving multiple African nations and leading to devastating consequences for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The First Congo War began in 1996 when Rwanda, Uganda, and their allies invaded Zaire to dismantle refugee camps that were housing Hutu extremists who had fled after the 1994 Rwandan Genocide. These forces backed Laurent Desire Kabila, who was a longtime rebel leader, forming the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, or AFDL, to overthrow the corrupt dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko. This war was fueled by long-standing ethnic tensions in eastern Congo, particularly between the indigenous Congolese and the Banyamulenge, or the Tutsi population, who had been targeted for expulsion by Mobutu's government. Laurent Desire Kabila's forces, with Rwandan and Ugandan military backing, would advance westward, leading to the collapse of Mobutu's already weakened state, and Kinshasa would fall in May of 1997, forcing Mobutu into exile, and Laurent Desire Kabila would assume power, renaming the country Democratic Republic of the Congo. However, tensions soon arose between Kabila and his former Rwandan and Ugandan allies, leading to his expulsion of foreign forces from the country, and this move would spark the Second Congo War in 1998, as Rwanda and Uganda would invade once again, this time to remove Kabila from power. That escalated into full-scale continental conflict, referred to as Africa's World War, drawing 9 nations and over 25 armed groups. While initially a struggle for power between Kabila and his former allies, the war quickly became a multifaceted crisis involving ethnic massacres, extreme human rights abuses, and competition over Congo's vast mineral wealth. This conflict would see mass killings, systematic use of sexual violence, and forced recruitment of child soldiers, with multiple factions engaging in these atrocities. Civilians would suffer the most, as disease and starvation spread due to the destruction of infrastructure and displacement of millions. Kabila himself would be assassinated in January 2001, and his son, Joseph Kabila, would take power, negotiating peace agreements that led to the official end of the war in 2003. However, the eastern regions of the Democratic Republic of the Congo have remained unstable, with ongoing insurgencies and resource-fueled conflicts continuing to this day, and the wars would result in an estimated 5.4 million deaths, and the genocide of the Banyamulenge and other ethnic groups left deep scars within the region. The wars also devastated Congo's economy, environment, and infrastructure, while enabling ongoing violence through the illicit trade of conflict minerals, leaving the country trapped in cycles of war and exploitation. The Nanking Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanjing or Nanking, was a mass atrocity committed by the Imperial Japanese Army after capturing the Chinese capital, Nanjing, during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The massacre began on December 13th, 1937 and lasted for about 6 weeks, during which Japanese troops engaged in widespread war crimes, including mass executions, rape, torture, looting, and arson. Estimates of the death toll vary, with numbers ranging from 40,000 to over 300,000, while reports of rape cases range from 20,000 to 80,000. The violence primarily targeted Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and any men suspected of being former soldiers, and Japanese soldiers indiscriminately slaughtered captives, often using them for brutal execution methods such as beheading contests, bayonet practice, or mass shootings. Women and girls of all ages were subjected to systematic rape, many of whom were subsequently murdered, and arson and looting devastated the city, with entire neighborhoods set ablaze and civilians slaughtered en masse. Key Japanese commanders, including General Iwane Matsui, were tried and executed for war crimes at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, but some individuals, like Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, were granted immunity due to their imperial status. The Trail of Tears was the forced removal and mass displacement of approximately 60,000 indigenous people, primarily the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to designated Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, between 1830 and 1850. This relocation was the direct result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which was championed by President Andrew Jackson, which sought to clear indigenous lands for white settlement, particularly for the expansion of cotton plantations and slavery. Despite legal battles such as Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, which ruled in favor of Cherokee sovereignty, Jackson and his successor, Martin Van Buren, ignored the Supreme Court's rulings and continued the removal policy. When the Cherokee and other nations refused to leave voluntarily, the U.S. military and state militias forcibly rounded up men, women, children, and elders, often imprisoning them in camps before beginning the grueling march westward. Exposure, disease, starvation, and physical exhaustion led to thousands of deaths, with estimates ranging from 4,000 to 8,000 Cherokee alone, alongside significant losses among other displaced nations. The Trail of Tears is widely regarded as an act of genocide and ethnic cleansing, as it resulted in the mass death, cultural destruction, and deliberate dispossession of indigenous people. Many of the survivors faced further hardship in Indian Territory, where they were forced into unfamiliar lands that had already been occupied by other indigenous nations, creating new conflicts. Furthermore, even after relocation, indigenous nations were subject to further land seizures, forced assimilation policies, and systematic oppression. The Herero and Nama Genocide was a brutal campaign of ethnic extermination and collective punishment carried out by the German Empire against the Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa, which is modern-day Namibia, between 1904 and 1908. Now, the conflict began when the Herero, under Samuel Maharero, and the Nama, led by Hendrik Witbooi, revolted against German colonial rule due to land seizures, exploitation, racial discrimination, and violent treatment by German settlers. On January 12, 1904, the Herero initiated an uprising, killing over 100 German settlers, which prompted severe military response. Under General Lothar von Trotha, German forces defeated the Herero at the Battle of Waterberg in August of 1904 and drove them into the arid Omaheke Desert, where many died of starvation and dehydration, as German soldiers sealed off water sources to prevent their escape, and survivors were rounded up and placed in concentration camps where they suffered forced labor, starvation, disease, and brutal medical experiments. Between 24,000 and 100,000 Herero and around 10,000 Nama people were killed in what is widely considered the first genocide of the 20th century, and General von Trotha explicitly stated that his goal was the annihilation of the Herero people, issuing an extermination order that declared all Herero, including women and children, to be shot if found within German-controlled territory. The genocide remained largely unrecognized for decades, but in 2015, Germany officially acknowledged it as a genocide, and in 2021, Germany pledged 1.1 billion euros in development and aid for the affected communities. The Circassian Genocide was the systematic mass killing, ethnic cleansing, and forced expulsion of the Circassian people by the Russian Empire during the final stages of the Caucasian War, which lasted from 1763 to 1864. To consolidate control over the North Caucasus, Russia waged a brutal campaign against the Circassians, employing scorched earth tactics, burning villages, destroying food supplies, and committing widespread massacres. Russian commanders such as General Grigory Zas openly advocated for extermination, with atrocities including impalement, rape, and beheadings, while survivors faced deportation to the Ottoman Empire, where many died from disease and starvation. It is estimated that 625,000 to 1.5 million Circassians were killed or expelled, nearly erasing their presence in their homeland, which Russia repopulated with Cossacks and settlers. Despite repeated appeals, Russia denies the genocide, calling it voluntary migration, though Georgia and Ukraine have officially recognized it. And every May 21st, Circassian Day of Mourning is observed through ceremonies, protests, and advocacy for recognition as the diaspora continues its struggle for historical justice and cultural preservation. The 10 Years War, beginning in 1868, was Cuba's first major struggle for independence from Spain, and it was marked by brutal Spanish repression, particularly against civilians suspected of supporting the Cuban insurgents. Spanish forces, led by General Blas Vitale, implemented scorched earth tactics, mass executions, and forced relocations to crush the rebellion. Vilate's campaign involved the systematic slaughter of peasants, destruction of villages, and the use of concentration camps. Spanish troops massacred prisoners and non-combatants. The war displaced thousands, with 100,000 Cubans fleeing to the U.S. and causing more than 200,000 deaths, primarily from combat, starvation, and disease, due to Spanish counterinsurgency. Though it ended with the Pact of Zanjon in 1878, Spain failed to enact reforms which fueled future conflicts, culminating in the Cuban War of Independence in 1895 and the eventual U.S. intervention in the Spanish-American War. The Hamidian Genocide was a systematic campaign of mass killings, forced conversions, and violent repression against Armenians in the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, resulting in the deaths of 100,000 to 300,000 Armenians and 25,000 Assyrians, while leaving 50,000 Armenian children orphaned. Fueled by Ottoman paranoia over Armenian calls for civil rights and economic instability, massacres would be carried out by Hamidiye regiments alongside Ottoman troops and Muslim mobs who burned villages, executed civilians, and forced thousands into Islam. Despite international condemnation, no intervention took place, allowing the Ottoman state to continue its policies of mass repression. And the Hamidian Genocide not only devastated Armenian and Christian communities, but also set a brutal precedent for the Armenian Genocide of 1915, demonstrating the Ottoman regime's willingness to use mass murder, forced Islamization, and systematic destruction against perceived internal threats. The Amazon Genocide, an ongoing humanitarian crisis, is the systematic destruction and decimation of indigenous tribes in Brazil, particularly those in the Amazon rainforest, through violent displacement, environmental destruction, and state negligence. Now, the genocide officially began with Portuguese colonization in 1500, which led to mass depopulation due to disease, slavery, and violent conflicts. However, while many colonial genocides ended with independence movements or decolonization, the targeting of indigenous tribes in Brazil has continued well into the 20th and 21st century. During the 20th century, over 80 indigenous tribes were wiped out, and Brazil's indigenous population fell from over 1 million to just 200,000 by 1957. Despite the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, which formally recognizes indigenous land rights, the reality remains grim, as logging, mining, cattle ranching, and infrastructure projects have destroyed vast portions of indigenous territories, and illegal encroachment by settlers, loggers, and miners have led to violent clashes, massacres, and the spread of deadly diseases. Even tribes that had previously survived in isolation have been brought to the edge of extinction. Government policies and negligence have further exacerbated the genocide, as the Figueiredo Report in 1967, a classified document released decades later, revealed that the Brazilian Indian Protection Service, or SPI, was complicit in enslaving, torturing, and exterminating indigenous groups through forced labor camps, land theft, and deliberate smallpox introductions. Under Bolsonaro's presidency, indigenous violence surged by 54%, with land invasions increasing and one indigenous person suffering violence every day on average. Bolsonaro's rhetoric and policies encouraged illegal mining and logging, while defunding and dismantling the FUNAI, or National Indian Foundation, which was an agency responsible for indigenous rights. In 2022, the last member of an uncontacted tribe known as the Man of the Hole would die alone in Tanaru indigenous territory, marking yet another example of a people erased through violence and environmental destruction. The Selk'nam Genocide was the systematic extermination and forced assimilation of the Selk'nam people, who were an indigenous group of the Tierra del Fuego during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as European and South American settlers expanded for sheep ranching, gold mining, and colonization. Wealthy landowners like Mauricio Braun and Jose Menendez financed militias and bounty hunters who were paid to kill Selk'nam, often providing severed hands, ears, or skulls as proof. Figures like Julius Popper actively participated in these massacres, leading to the Selk'nam population dropping from 4,000 in the 1880s to fewer than 500 by the early 20th century. Survivors were forcibly relocated to Christian missions where they faced disease, forced labor, and cultural destruction, and children were abducted and assimilated, severing them from their heritage. And by 1974, the last full-blooded Selk'nam, Angela Loij, passed away, marking the functional extinction of their culture. The Moriori Genocide was the systematic mass murder, enslavement, and cultural destruction of the Moriori people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Chatham Islands, by the Ngati Mutunga and the Ngati Tama, who were two Maori tribes from mainland New Zealand in 1835. The Moriori were a pacifist Polynesian people and chose nonviolence in response to the invasion, but the Maori interpreted their gathering as a threat and launched a brutal preemptive attack, killing around 300, including acts of torture and impalement, while survivors were enslaved and forbidden from speaking their language or practicing their culture. The genocide lasted nearly 3 decades, with the Moriori population plummeting from 1,700 to just 101 survivors by the time slavery was abolished in 1863. Despite their emancipation, the Native Land Court awarded 97% of Moriori land to the Maori in 1870, further cementing their marginalization, and by 1933, the last full-blooded Moriori, Tommy Solomon, passed away. And after decades of activism, the Waitangi Tribunal formally recognized the Moriori as the original inhabitants of the Chatham Islands in 2001, leading to a treaty settlement in 2020 with land transfers, financial compensation, and official acknowledgement. The Dzungar Genocide in 1755 was the mass extermination of the Dzungar Mongols by the Qing dynasty under Emperor Qianlong, following the Qing conquest of Dzungaria in modern-day Xinjiang, China. Initially seeking to integrate the Dzungars, the Qing shifted to total annihilation after Dzungar leader Amusana rebelled in 1755. Qianlong ordered the systematic destruction of the Dzungars through massacres, starvation, enslavement, and biological warfare, leading to the death of 80% of their population. Qing forces slaughtered entire communities, enslaved survivors, and forcibly assimilated others, completely erasing Dzungar identity. And Qianlong himself justified the genocide as a divine mandate, branding the Dzungars as barbarians who had to be exterminated for peace, and historians classify it as one of the most significant genocides of the 18th century. The Ethiopian Red Terror in 1976 was a brutal political repression campaign led by the Derg, who were a Marxist-Leninist military junta under Mengistu Haile Mariam, aimed at eliminating opposition groups, particularly the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, or EPRP. Inspired by Leninist ideology, Mengistu systematically targeted civilians, students, and intellectuals through mass arrests, extrajudicial executions, torture, and forced disappearances, with victims' bodies often being left in streets as warnings. Government death squads, known as permanent secretaries, patrolled the streets, executing thousands, with families being forced to pay for the bullets that they used to kill their relatives. Public massacres included burning people alive in churches and executing children, with death toll estimates ranging from 100,000 to 980,000. And the terror would peak in 1977, before subsiding in 1978 as the Derg turned its focus to external wars, and Mengistu would rule until 1991 when he fled to Zimbabwe, avoiding prosecution, but would eventually be convicted of genocide in absentia in 2007. The massacres during the partition of India in 1947 were among the bloodiest episodes of communal violence in history, resulting in one of the largest forced migrations and mass killings of the 20th century. With the division of British India into the newly formed nations of India and Pakistan, communal hostilities between Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims erupted into widespread massacres, ethnic cleansing, abduction, sexual violence, and large-scale destruction. The violence was especially concentrated in Punjab and Bengal, the two provinces that were divided along religious lines. Retributive massacres targeted Muslims in Indian Punjab and Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistani Punjab, leading to the near total displacement of populations. Armed militias and communal mobs burned villages, slaughtered entire communities, and engaged in mass rapes. And the estimated death toll from the partition massacres remains heavily disputed, with figures ranging from 200,000 to 2 million. And the total number of people forced to flee from their ancestral homes exceeded 14 million, making it the largest forced migration in recorded history. The Carthaginian Genocide in 146 BC was the systematic destruction of Carthage by the Roman Republic at the end of the Third Punic War, marking it as one of the earliest instances of total warfare and ethnic destruction in recorded history. After decades of rivalry between Rome and Carthage, the Romans Senate, driven by figures like Cato the Elder, who famously declared that Carthage must be destroyed, launched a final campaign to eliminate its longtime adversary. Despite Carthage's initial resistance, the vastly superior Roman forces breached the city's defenses in early 146 BC after a brutal siege that lasted nearly 3 years. What followed was an orchestrated extermination of Carthage's population. Roman soldiers slaughtered tens of thousands in the streets, while survivors, estimated at 50,000, were sold into slavery, and the city was systematically looted and burned, with every building razed to the ground, and Roman forces even plowed salt into the soil to ensure that Carthage could never rise again. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were among the most devastating military campaigns in human history, characterized by widespread massacres, ethnic cleansing, and population extermination across Asia and parts of Europe. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire expanded at an unprecedented rate, using advanced military tactics, psychological warfare, and brutal reprisals to subdue populations that resisted their rule. Entire cities were systematically razed, their populations slaughtered, and their cultures erased, leading some historians to classify these events as acts of genocide. Mongol forces executed hundreds of thousands to millions of people, often depopulating entire regions. And although the Mongol rulers later assimilated into local cultures and contributed to trade and cultural exchange, their initial campaigns were marked by a scale of mass killings that reshaped demographics and left entire regions depopulated for generations. The Crusades were a series of religiously motivated military campaigns aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land and were marked by widespread massacres of Jews, Muslims, and even Eastern Christians. The violence began with the People's Crusade as unruly bands of crusaders slaughtered Jewish communities in 1096, spurred by anti-Semitic fervor, and in the First Crusade, after the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, crusaders indiscriminately killed tens of thousands of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, turning its streets into rivers of blood. These campaigns were not limited to external enemies, as heretics and dissenters in Europe were also targets of crusader violence, and the massacres, often justified as acts of divine will, were fueled by religious zealotry, political ambitions, and cultural animosity, leaving a legacy of destruction and deep-seated mistrust among the religious communities of Europe and the Near East. The conquest of the Americas, beginning in 1492, led to one of the largest and most devastating genocides in human history, resulting in the near extermination of indigenous populations across North, Central, and South America. Following Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492, European powers, primarily Spain, Portugal, and France, launched a brutal campaign of conquest and forced conversion, systematically destroying indigenous civilizations. Pre-Columbian societies such as the Aztec Empire, Inca Empire, and various North American tribal nations were devastated by a combination of military violence, enslavement, forced labor, and disease. The introduction of smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the indigenous people had no immunity, wiped out an estimated 50 to 90% of native populations within the first century of contact. European conquerors like Hernan Cortez in Mexico and Francisco Pizarro in Peru massacred indigenous people en masse, burning cities, executing rulers, and enslaving survivors. In North America, British and later American policies of forced removal, massacres, and cultural destruction, such as the Trail of Tears, like we talked about, and the California Indian Genocide, continued this pattern into the 19th and 20th centuries, and over 50 million indigenous people are estimated to have perished as a direct or indirect result of European conquest and colonization, marking it as one of the most catastrophic genocides in recorded history, with lasting effects that continue to impact indigenous communities to this day. The arrival of Europeans in Hawaii, beginning with Captain James Cook in 1778, marked the onset of a devastating period for native Hawaiians as diseases and violence associated with colonization decimated their population. Initially numbering around 300,000 to 500,000, the native population plummeted due to exposure to foreign diseases such as smallpox, measles, and venereal infections to which they had no immunity. These epidemics swept through the islands, killing tens of thousands and destabilizing the traditional social and political structures. The violence further compounded the suffering as clashes with Europeans, particularly during Cook's voyages and later conflicts with traders, missionaries, and settlers, turned deadly. The introduction of firearms and foreign military tactics, as well as land seizures and cultural disruptions, would exacerbate the chaos, and by the 1820s, a combination of disease, displacement, and violent encounters had reduced the native Hawaiian population to fewer than 150,000, signaling the irreversible toll of European colonization on the island's indigenous people. The massacres of native Australians during the 19th century were a devastating consequence of European colonization, resulting in the widespread killing and displacement of the Aboriginal peoples. As settlers expanded across the continent, seizing land for agriculture and settlements, conflicts erupted between the colonizers and indigenous populations, whose deep spiritual and cultural ties to the land were disregarded. These confrontations frequently culminated in violent massacres, with entire Aboriginal communities being attacked, often in retaliation for perceived threats or resistance to colonization. The massacres were not isolated events, but part of a systematic campaign that included poisoning food supplies, forced removals, and deliberate extermination efforts under the guise of, quote, settling land. Such violence, compounded by the introduction of foreign diseases and disruption of traditional ways of life, decimated the Aboriginal population, leading to the immense loss of life, culture, and sovereignty. The Great Irish Famine in 1845, also known as the Potato Famine, was a devastating period in Ireland's history during which over 1 million people died and an additional 2 million immigrated, which dramatically reduced the island's population. The famine was triggered by a potato blight that decimated Ireland's primary food source for the majority of its impoverished population. And while the natural disaster was catastrophic, the British government's policies greatly exacerbated its impact, turning a crisis into a humanitarian catastrophe. Ireland, which was under British rule, continued to export large quantities of food to England while its population starved, as British economic policies prioritized free markets over direct intervention, and British officials dismissed Irish suffering as a natural correction for overpopulation and mismanagement, revealing a deep-seated prejudice towards the Irish. And the famine left a profound legacy of grief, mistrust, and anger towards British rule, fueling Irish nationalism and shaping Ireland's socio-political landscape for generations. The Congo Free State atrocities from 1885 to 1908 occurred under the personal colony of King Leopold II of Belgium and became a site that resulted in the deaths of millions of Congolese. Under Leopold's rule, the region was exploited for its vast natural resources, particularly rubber and ivory, through a brutal system of forced labor. Villages were terrorized by soldiers of the Force Publique, a paramilitary force that coerced quotas of rubber and punished dissent with unspeakable violence, including mutilations, massacres, and the burning of entire communities. Workers who failed to meet demands often had their hands amputated as proof of punishment, and starvation, disease, and exhaustion further decimated the population, with some estimates placing the death toll as high as 10 million. The atrocities were shrouded in secrecy until international outcry, sparked by accounts from missionaries, journalists, and activists, forced Leopold to relinquish control of the Congo in 1908. However, the legacy of exploitation, devastation, and trauma endured long after the Congo was transferred to Belgian state control. The ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War has been accompanied by accusations of genocide committed by Russia and its ally Belarus against the Ukrainian people, particularly following Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Legal experts, historians, and international bodies, which include the International Criminal Court, or ICC, the Council of Europe, and Genocide Watch, have cited numerous war crimes, including mass killings, torture, rape, forced deportations, and filtration camps, as a part of a broader pattern of ethnic destruction. The Bucha massacre, among other atrocities, have been widely documented, with reports indicating systematic execution of civilians, sexual violence, and deliberate starvation tactics. Also, the forced deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia through these filtration camps, totaling over 300,000, has been classified as genocide by the Council of Europe, aligning with Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, which prohibits the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova have been indicted by the ICC for these crimes related to these deportations, making Putin the first sitting leader of a UN Security Council member to face an ICC arrest warrant. However, Russia's state rhetoric, particularly from Putin in Russian media, has repeatedly denied Ukraine's national identity, with figures such as Timofey Sergeytsev publishing openly genocidal manifestos advocating for Ukraine's cultural and physical destruction. And the international community remains divided on formal recognition, but countries like Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, alongside various global organizations, have officially acknowledged Russia's actions as genocide. The Iraqi Turkmen Genocide refers to the systematic killings, executions, mass rapes, expulsions, and sexual slavery of Iraqi Turkmens by ISIS, beginning in 2014 when the terrorist group captured Turkmen majority areas and continuing until ISIS was driven out of Iraq. The genocide was recognized by the Iraqi parliament in 2017 and the United Nations in 2018, specifically acknowledging the enslavement of Turken women and girls. Iraqi Turkmens, the third largest ethnic group in Iraq, had already faced persecution under Saddam Hussein's regime, and when ISIS seized Tal Afar, Mosul, Tikrit, and parts of Kirkuk and Diyala, thousands of Turkmens were abducted, tortured, and executed, with the entire villages being razed. More than 350,000 Turkmens were displaced, forced into desperate conditions without food or water, leading to starvation and death. And the ISIS fighters, many of whom were former Ba'athist soldiers from Saddam Hussein's army, targeted Turkmens based on their ethnicity and sect, with both Shia and Sunni Turkmens suffering mass executions, forced conversions, and ethnic cleansing. Effacer le Tableau was the name given to the genocide of the Bambuti Pygmies carried out by rebel forces during the Second Congo War in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This campaign, launched in 2002, was primarily executed by soldiers from the Movement of the Liberation of the Congo, or MLC, led by Jean-Pierre Bemba, alongside troops from the Rally for Congolese Democracy, or RCDN. These rebels, known locally as the Erasers, sought to ethnically cleanse the North Kivu province, targeting the Bambuti population of approximately 90,000. The rebels considered the Bambuti subhuman and believed that consuming their flesh conferred magical powers, which was a superstition fueled by biblical justifications of senior officers. And reports of cannibalism were widespread, with investigators documenting that all forces involved in the Second Congo War engaged in attacks, massacres, and atrocities against the Bambuti. By the end of the campaign, an estimated 60,000 to 70,000 Bambuti had been slaughtered, with over 100,000 more displaced, facing starvation and continued persecution. And Jean-Pierre Bemba would be convicted by the ICC in 2016 for human rights violations in the Central African Republic. However, he was fully acquitted on appeal in 2018. The Isaac Genocide, known as the Hargeisa Holocaust, was a systematic, state-sponsored campaign of mass murder, rape, and ethnic cleansing carried out by the Somali Democratic Republic under Siad Barre between 1987 and 1989, targeting the Isaac clan during the Somaliland War of Independence. The Somali armed forces, including a specialized unit known as Dabar Gointa Isaka, or the Isaac Exterminators, were responsible for massacring between 50,000 and 100,000 Isaac civilians, though local reports estimate up to 200,000 deaths through mass executions, indiscriminate aerial bombardment, and the destruction of key cities such as Hargeisa. These attacks led to 500,000 Isaacs fleeing Ethiopia, while another 400,000 were internally displaced. The Somali government also engaged in the systemic use of sexual violence against Isaac women, the looting and destruction of Isaac properties, and the deliberate planting of 1 million landmines in Isaac territory to prevent resettlement. However, despite the sheer scale of the atrocities, the genocide remains largely unrecognized internationally. The Gurukhamundi Genocide in Zimbabwe was a brutal campaign of mass killings, torture, and repression carried out by Robert Mugabe's government from 1983 to 1987, targeting the Ndebele and Kalanga people. The conflict stemmed from political tensions between Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU, which recruited mainly from the Shona majority, and Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union, which had broader ethnic support but was strongest among the Ndebele. Now, this divide, which dated back to colonial era rivalries and tribal conflicts, would be exacerbated by the Rhodesian Bush War and the difficulties integrating the two nationalist forces. And following this war, ZANU's military wing and ZAPU's military wing would have trouble confining themselves into a unified national army after Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. Repression between the two ethnic groups would intensify in early 1983 when Mugabe would deploy the North Korean-trained 5th Brigade, an elite military unit under his direct control, to eliminate so-called dissidents. His brigade's campaign would be marked by indiscriminate massacres, mass rapes, forced disappearances, torture, and executions. Many victims would be forced to dig their own graves before being summarily shot, while entire villages were burned and civilians were rounded up, beaten, and killed in public executions, with an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 people being killed. Robert Mugabe's government dismissed these allegations, blaming them on foreign propaganda and claiming that they were a necessary response to violent ZAPU-linked dissidents. The massacres ended with the 1987 Unity Accord, which merged ZANU and ZAPU into the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriot Front, or ZANU-PF, effectively eliminating political opposition, and the aftermath would leave deep scars, with survivors suffering from poverty, trauma, and government neglect. The genocide of the Acholi and Lango people in Uganda from 1972 to 1978 was a brutal campaign of ethnic persecution and mass killings carried out under the regime of Idi Amin, targeting members of the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups primarily because of their historical association with the previous government of Milton Obote. Now, when Amin had seized power in 1971, he viewed these groups, which had historically dominated the Ugandan military and civil service, as a threat to his rule. So, his security forces, particularly the State Research Bureau and the Public Safety Unit, along with loyalist soldiers, launched a systematic campaign of executions, enforced disappearances, and torture against Acholi and Lango individuals, especially those in military, police, and government positions. Thousands were rounded up, taken to secret detention centers, and executed, with mass graves later being discovered. The killings intensified after Amin purged the army in 1972, replacing Acholi and Lango officers with members of his own Kakwa and Nubian ethnic groups. And human rights organizations suggest that between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed under Amin's rule, and that genocide would effectively cripple the Acholi and Lango political and military influence, leaving their communities devastated and paving the way for decades of further ethnic strife in Uganda. The Zanzibar Genocide occurred during and after the Zanzibar Revolution of January 12, 1964, when the island's black African majority overthrew the Arab-dominated government of Sultan Jamshid bin Abdullah in a violent uprising that was led by John Okello of the Afro-Shirazi Party, or ASP. Rooted in centuries of Arab dominance, the massacre targeted Zanzibar's Arab and South Asian minorities, who were viewed as oppressors due to their historical role in the slave trade, land ownership, and political control. Thousands of Arab civilians were murdered, raped, and tortured by Okello's African militiamen, often in gruesome ways, including mutilation, mass executions, and forced deportations. Estimates of the death toll range from 13,000 to over 20,000 people, with Okello himself boasting that he had personally killed over 8,000 people, and the violence was so extreme that bodies filled the streets, and Arabs were often hacked to death with machetes and their corpses desecrated and thrown into mass graves. The genocide effectively ended 250 years of Arab rule, forcing many survivors to flee, mainly to Oman and the United Kingdom, while thousands were detained in camps and later exiled. The siege of Leningrad, lasting 872 days from 1941 to 1944, was one of the deadliest and most destructive blockades in history, with an estimated 1.5 million deaths, mostly from starvation. Encircled by German and Finnish forces, the city was deliberately cut off from supplies, with Hitler ordering its total destruction, seeing Leningrad as both a symbol of Bolshevism and a strategic military target. German forces, instead of capturing the city, resorted to a war of attrition, systematically bombing infrastructure and starving the civilian population, whom Nazi leadership considered racially expendable. The winter of 1941 and 1942 was particularly brutal, with residents forced to survive on meager bread rations mixed with sawdust, leading to mass deaths in the streets, reports of cannibalism, and families consuming glue and leather to stave off starvation. Soviet resistance, however, was fierce. The city's remaining workforce, including women and children, helped build fortifications, while the Road of Life, a precarious ice highway over Lake Ladoga, provided a fragile supply route. By January 1943, a narrow corridor was opened, but the siege was only fully lifted on January 27, 1944, after a massive Soviet counteroffensive. The long-term devastation was staggering, as entire districts were obliterated, art and historical landmarks looted, and hundreds of thousands of residents forcibly evacuated, with many perishing in transit. Historians have classified the siege as genocide, citing the systematic starvation and extermination policies imposed by the Nazis, though it was not legally prosecuted as a war crime. The deportation of the Crimean Tatars from May 18th to May 20th, 1944 was an act of ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide that was carried out by the Soviet NKVD under Joseph Stalin's orders, forcibly relocating at least 200,000 Crimean Tatars from their homeland in Crimea to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Siberia under the pretext of punishing them for alleged collaboration with Nazi Germany during World War II, despite the fact that twice as many Crimean Tatars served in the Red Army as those who collaborated with the Axis. Deported in cattle trains with little food, water, or hygiene, thousands perished en route, and tens of thousands more died in exile due to malnutrition, forced labor, and disease. The operation sought to completely erase Crimean Tatar identity, as Soviet authorities confiscated homes, destroyed cultural sites, and banned Crimean Tatars from returning, branding them as traitors. Even after Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, Tatars remained banned from returning until the perestroika reforms of the late 1980s, when around 260,000 finally returned, only to face discrimination and legal obstacles. By 2004, they comprised 12% of Crimea's population, yet never received compensation or restitution for their stolen land. And the deportation has since been recognized as genocide by Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Canada, Poland, Estonia, and the Czech Republic. Suffering remain a point of tension, especially following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, which led to further human rights abuses, arrests, and exile of Crimean Tatar leaders, demonstrating a continued struggle against systemic persecution. The genocide of Bosniaks and Croats by the Chetniks during World War II was a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing and mass killings driven by Serbian nationalist and royalist ideology, aimed at creating a greater Serbia through extermination, expulsion, and forced assimilation of non-Serb populations, primarily Muslims and Croats. Now, this movement, led by Draza Mihailovic, envisioned ethnically pure Serbian territories achieved through the mass removal of non-Serbs. Chetniks, initially a royal resistance force, turned into a collaborationist militia, particularly aligning with fascist Italy and later Nazi Germany, carrying out massacres, forced conversions, and the destruction of villages, mosques, and churches. This genocidal campaign peaked between 1942 and 1943, with major massacres that led to tens of thousands of Muslims and Croats being brutally killed. Entire villages were razed and populations were forcibly displaced, with estimates of total deaths ranging from 50,000 to 68,000 in Bosnia and Croatia alone. Civilians were slaughtered, burned alive, or drowned in rivers, often in acts of calculated ethnic and religious persecution. And while some Chetnik atrocities were initially framed as reprisals against the Ustase's genocide of Serbs, it became clear that their wider objective was to purge non-Serbs from areas that they sought to annex into Greater Serbia, whether or not their victims were actually involved in the war. Now, despite suffering major defeats to the partisans in 1943, their terror tactics continued until the war's end. After the war, Mihailovich would be tried and executed for war crimes and treason, yet broader Chetnik accountability remained limited, with many perpetrators escaping justice or even integrating into the post-war Yugoslav regime. On the other hand, the genocide of Serbs in the independent state of Croatia was a systematic campaign of extermination, persecution, and ethnic cleansing carried out by the Ustase regime, a Nazi puppet state, between 1941 and 1945. Their ideologies were rooted in extreme Croatian nationalism and anti-Serb ideology, and the Ustase, led by Ante Pavelić, sought to create a ethnically pure Greater Croatia by implementing policies of mass murder, forced conversions, and expulsions. Influenced by 19th and early 20th century Croatian nationalist thought, the Ustase adopted Nazi-like racial laws, viewing Serbs as a primary enemy alongside Jews and Roma. Large-scale massacres were carried out across villages, often using crude weapons like knives, axes, and mallets, and concentration camps, including Jasenovac being the most notorious extermination site, was established where tens of thousands of Serbs, as well as Jews and Roma, were brutally tortured and killed, where starvation, medical experiments, and mass executions were common. An estimate suggests between 200,000 and 500,000 Serbs were murdered, 300,000 expelled, and at least 200,000 forcibly converted to Catholicism. And Ustase leaders, including Pavelić, escaped primarily to Latin America, while others will be tried and executed by Yugoslav communist authorities. The Parsley Massacre, also known as El Corte or the Cutting, was the mass killing of Haitians and Afro-Dominicans ordered by Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo in October of 1937. Dominican troops, using rifles, machetes, and bayonets, slaughtered an estimated 14,000 to 40,000 Haitians. The massacre targeted Haitian communities living along the northwestern Dominican border, and with many victims brutally executed while trying to flee. Troops identified Haitians through a linguistic test, demanding that they pronounced parsley, and those who mispronounced it in the Haitian manner were immediately killed. Survivors recounted horrific atrocities, including babies being impaled on bayonets and victims bound and thrown into the ocean to be eaten by sharks. And the massacre was justified by Trujillo as a means of protecting Dominican resources and national identity. And initially, discussions about the killings were suppressed, but after international pressure, Trujillo paid Haiti $525,000 in reparations. Those survivors only received a few cents each. The Libyan Genocide, known in Libya as Shar or Evil, was the systematic extermination of Libyan Arabs and the destruction of Libyan culture by Italian colonial authorities under Benito Mussolini during and after the Second Italo-Senussi War. Between 20,000 and 100,000 Libyans perished through mass executions, forced displacement, death marches, and the internment of nearly half the population of Cyrenaica in concentration camps where starvation, disease, and brutal conditions led to staggering mortality rates. Italian officials orchestrated these policies aimed at annihilating the Libyan population to make way for settler colonialism, and Mussolini's regime would employ chemical warfare, poison water sources, and erected barbed wire barriers along the Egyptian border to prevent resistance fighters from receiving aid. The genocide was also heavily censored by fascist Italy, with archives destroyed and information suppressed, though mass graves and survivor testimonies would attest to the atrocities. And scholars have drawn direct links between the Libyan genocide and the Holocaust, as key Nazi figures, including Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, visited Libya to observe Italian colonial methods, which later influenced Nazi expansionist and genocidal policies. The Albanian Genocide refers to the mass killings, forced expulsions, and systematic violence perpetrated by Serbian and Montenegrin forces against the Albanian population in Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Albania during the Balkan Wars, World War I, and the interwar period. Now, between 1912 and 1913, as Serbian and Montenegrin armies seized former Ottoman territories, they engaged in massacres, ethnic cleansing, and forced migrations aimed at altering the region's demographics before the London Ambassadors' Conference. Reports from contemporary sources, including European diplomats and humanitarian commissions, estimated that between 120,000 and 270,000 Albanians were killed, with Serbian forces destroying hundreds of villages, forcibly converting Muslim and Catholic Albanians to Serbian Orthodoxy, and carrying out mass executions, including beheadings and mutilations. Women and children were among the primary victims, with accounts describing entire families burned alive, bodies impaled, and heads displayed as warnings. And in Kosovo and Macedonia alone, an estimated 120,000 Albanians were massacred and 300,000 were expelled. Reports detailed forced death marches where Albanian captives were made to walk miles under starvation and exhaustion, and those who collapsed were bayoneted on the spot. And similar atrocities would follow during World War I, with Serbian, Montenegrin, Bulgarian, and Greek forces continuing their campaign against Albanians, destroying hundreds of villages, executing civilians, and conducting mass deportations. Now, the Serbian government, while denying its actions, was accused by international commissions of a deliberate policy of extermination and ethnic cleansing, with documented orders from Serbian officials calling for the complete eradication of Albanians. Many Albanians fled to Turkey or sought refuge in the mountains, but perished from exposure, starvation, or disease. And in 1919, the Kosovo Committee claimed that Serbian and Montenegrin forces had killed 200,000 Albanians since the Balkan Wars, and the aftermath of these atrocities continued into the interwar period and beyond, with Albanians in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia facing systemic persecution, land confiscation, and cultural repression, culminating in the later waves of violence during the 20th century. The Hazara Genocide occurred in the 19th century under Afghan Emir Abdur Rahman, who, following the Second Anglo-Afghan War and the Treaty of Gandamak, sought to consolidate his rule over Turkestan, Hazaristan, and Kafiristan, viewing the predominantly Shia Hazara minority as a political and religious threat. Therefore, he launched a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing, massacring over 60% of the Hazara population, forcibly displacing thousands and enslaving many, particularly women and children. The violence peaked in three major uprisings between 1888 and 1893, with Hazaras resisting excessive taxation, land confiscations, and forced assimilation into Sunni Islam, and Abdur Rahman exploited internal Hazara divisions and declared jihad against them, amassing an army of over 150,000 troops, and entire villages were burned and depopulated. Thousands would flee to Iran, Pakistan, and northern Afghanistan, with thousands more submitting or perishing. And estimates suggest that 400,000 Hazara families were displaced, with 80% of them either being killed or enslaved. The Putumayo Genocide, spanning from the late 19th to early 20th century, was a brutal campaign of enslavement, exploitation, and extermination against the indigenous populations of the Amazon. Now driven by the global demand for rubber, Peruvian rubber baron Julio Cesar Arana and his enterprise, the Peruvian Amazon Company, systematically subjected these indigenous groups through forced labor, torture, mass starvation, and massacres. The company utilized indigenous enforcers known as muchachos de confianza, along with Barbadian laborers, to oversee these atrocities, which included flogging, immolation, dismemberment, and the mass killing of those deemed unproductive or rebellious. Entire tribes were wiped out, and 9 in every 10 targeted indigenous people were either murdered, starved, or displaced. The enslaved workforce was subjected to terror as they were forced to extract rubber under impossible quotas, often walking over 60 miles carrying heavy loads with no food, while their families were either enslaved or exterminated. The company's stations functioned as de facto death camps where indigenous men, women, and children were brutalized or executed at the whim of the company's agents, and massacres were common, with entire villages razed and survivors taken as prisoners or slaughtered. Despite 215 arrest warrants issued in 1911 against the perpetrators, the company continued its operations, with many of the criminals evading justice and some even resuming exploitation in other parts of the Amazon, and Arana and his partners would remain largely largely unpunished. Even after the dissolution of the Peruvian Amazon Company, the forced displacement and destruction of indigenous communities continued, with over 6,700 indigenous people forcibly relocated between 1924 and 1930, half of whom perished from disease and other hardships. The California Genocide, spanning from 1846 to 1873, was a series of state-sanctioned and settler-led massacres, forced labor practices, and systematic policies aimed at the extermination and displacement of indigenous Californians. Following the American conquest of California during the Mexican-American War and the subsequent gold rush, thousands of Native Americans were killed, forcibly removed from their lands, enslaved, or subjected to brutal conditions that led to widespread death through starvation, disease, and exploitation. The state's first governor, Peter Burnett, openly declared that a war of extermination against the native population would continue until their extinction. And the government financially supported militias that carried out massacres against Native Americans, and laws such as the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians legalized native enslavement, leading to the forced labor of between 10,000 and 27,000 indigenous people. The genocide was characterized by indiscriminate killings, child separation, forced removals, and government complicity at both state and federal levels, with U.S. funds reimbursing settler-led militias for their mass killings. Demographers estimate that California's native population plummeted from around 150,000 to 16,000 by 1900 due to a combination of systematic violence, disease, and starvation. And even after the massacres subsided, Native Americans faced continued oppression through forced assimilation policies such as the removal of children to boarding schools and eugenics-based sterilization programs. It was really bad. They didn't teach this one in a history class. The Taino Genocide, perpetrated by the Spanish Empire between 1492 and 1514, resulted in the near eradication of the Taino people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean, through slavery, massacres, forced labor, famine, and disease. Now, before Spanish colonization, the Taino population in Hispaniola alone was estimated to be between 10,000 and 1 million, but by 1514, only 32,000 remained. And by 1802, Spanish authorities falsely declared them extinct in an attempt to erase their existence from history. An estimated 80% to 90% of their population perished. And yeah. The transatlantic slave trade, also known as MAFA, spanning from the 15th to 19th centuries, was a devastating system in which millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands and transported under brutal conditions to the Americas, fueling European colonial economies in the Industrial Revolution while leaving enduring legacies of demographic imbalance, economic underdevelopment, and cultural disruption in Africa. This vast network involved European powers including Britain, Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and later the United States, and African intermediaries who, for various reasons, participated in or acquiesced to the trade, which was driven by the enormous profits generated by cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, and coffee, as well as by the acquisition of military technology and manufactured goods that reshaped indigenous African economies and social structures. The trade not only led to the forced separation of families and significant population losses in many African regions, but also contributed to the rise of institutionalized racism and the development of scientific theories that dehumanized African peoples, justifying centuries of exploitation and slavery. And in the aftermath, the legacy of the slave trade has continued to shape global socioeconomic dynamics and race relations, prompting modern calls for acknowledgement, reparative justice, and formal apologies from nations that once profited from the system. The Great Purge, also called the Great Terror, was a brutal campaign of political repression orchestrated by Joseph Stalin to eliminate perceived threats within the Communist Party and consolidate his absolute control over the Soviet Union. Initially targeting old Bolsheviks, party officials, and government leaders associated with former opposition factions, the purges would soon expand to encompass the military, ethnic minorities, and ordinary Soviet citizens who were accused of counter-revolutionary activities. The campaign was driven by Stalin's paranoia, his belief in foreign conspiracies, and his desire to preemptively eliminate any potential fifth column that could destabilize Soviet rule in the event of war. Carried out primarily by the NKVD under Genrikh Yagoda and later Nikolai Yezhov, mass arrests, brutal interrogations, and forced confessions obtained through torture and widespread executions would become the norm, while millions were sentenced to the Gulag labor camps under fabricated charges of espionage, sabotage, or opposition to Stalinist policies. The purges also targeted the Red Army with thousands of officers executed, weakening Soviet military leadership, and ethnic minorities, particularly Poles, Ukrainians, Ingrian Finns, and Koreans, were disproportionately persecuted under NKVD directives that associated them with foreign enemies. By 1938, Stalin recognized the destabilizing effects of the purges and turned against the NKVD leadership, executing Yagoda and Yezhov. Although the official death toll of the executions reached nearly 700,000, broader estimates suggest that between 950,000 and 1.2 million people perished. The Great Gypsy Roundup of 1749 was a state-orchestrated campaign of mass arrest, forced labor, and cultural extermination targeting Spain's Romani population, ultimately amounting to a genocidal effort that sought their systematic dissolution. Initiated under the rule of King Ferdinand VI, the roundup was carried out simultaneously across Spain and on July 30th, 1749, and the operation, planned in secrecy, was initially designed to expel the Roma to Spanish colonies in the Americas, but after observing the failure of similar deportation policy in Portugal, Spanish authorities would shift to mass internment. And on the day of the roundup, Spanish troops encircled Romani settlements, forcibly arresting nearly 9,000 individuals, dividing families, and confiscating property. And able-bodied men were sent to forced labor in naval arsenals, mines, prisons, and factories, while women and children were forced into textile production. Many Roma, especially those who were married to non-Roma or those who received support from local communities, were released within 3 months due to widespread protests. However, around 4,000 would remain in prison, suffering in inhumane conditions for up to 8 years. And by 1763, the final 100 detainees were freed by royal decree. The White Terror in the former Russian Empire refers to the mass violence, executions, and political repression carried out by the White Movement during the Russian Civil War. It began in response to the Bolshevik seizure of power and continued until the defeat of the White forces. And unlike the systematic and state-sanctioned Red Terror initiated by the Bolsheviks in 1918, the White Terror was largely decentralized, often carried out by independent anti-Bolshevik factions, Cossack warlords, and regional white governments, and the death toll is highly contested, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to over 500,000 victims, excluding the large-scale programs against Jews, which resulted in an additional 100,000 to 250,000 deaths, recognized by the United Nations as an example of genocide. The Red Terror would begin around a year later, carried out by the Bolsheviks, primarily through the Cheka secret police, beginning in 1918, and it was officially launched in response to the assassination attempts on Bolshevik leaders, including Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin and Bolshevik leaders would justify the mass executions as a necessary response to the White Terror, civil war pressures, and the risk of counter-revolution. The Cheka carried out mass shootings, hostage executions, and widespread torture in cities. The terror extended beyond political opponents to include peasants resisting forced grain requisitions, industrial workers demanding better conditions, and clergy members, many of whom were subjected to gruesome public executions. Historical estimates of the number of victims vary widely, ranging from as many as 200,000 to 1.3 million, and many Western historians remain divided on the nature of the Red Terror, with some arguing that it was an organized ideological campaign of systemic violence and genocide aimed at reconstructing society, while others contend it was a reactive and chaotic response to civil war threats. And yeah, that's pretty much all we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, I'm getting worse and worse at these outros because I really don't know what to say. Like, I can't just be like, oh yeah, have a great one. I hope you enjoyed the video. Yeah, man. I don't know. Yeah, I want to thank you guys for watching. Again, thank you for 50,000 subscribers. And I hope you're doing well. Yeah. I'll catch you in the next one. I love you, bro.